Friendship is one of the most unique, interesting, and downright hilarious comedy films made in recent years. It capitalizes on such a niche genre of comedy in such a bizarre and oftentimes terrifying way that throughout the entire duration of its runtime stands as a piece of art that is entrancing, thought-provoking, and I would argue not like any other film, at least not that I've seen. It's a movie that has mastered absurdist, awkward, and uncomfortable comedy, but that also has a lot on its mind, and shares a very unique perspective not often depicted in film. So, Friendship was actually my most anticipated movie of 2025. I got introduced to Tim Robinson a few years back through a Red Letter Media video where they brought up his excellent comedy series, I Think You Should Leave.
I don't even want to be around anymore.
What?
I don't want to be around anymore.
I watched a few segments from the show and was absolutely hooked, and it's remained my favorite just straight-up comedy series since I was introduced to it. So, of course, years later, when I found out that A24, the studio that notoriously just hands out near complete creative control to its directors, writers, and etc., and has put out a ridiculous amount of crazy good movies, was producing a Tim Robinson comedy film with Paul Rudd of all people, I was beyond excited. I'm a guy who really prefers to go into stuff completely blind though, so I never watched the trailer or anything related to the film. I just showed up opening weekend with the knowledge that it was a movie with Tim Robinson and Paul Rudd, and that it was supposed to be a comedy. I assumed probably a comedy with a lot of discomfort and weirdness, but still a fairly light comedic watch at its core. So I'm sure you can imagine my surprise when the movie began, and this is the first thing that I heard. This moment was magic. Just magic. In one single instant, I realized that this was very much not going to be the type of movie I was expecting it to be. In this moment, I truly had no idea what I was in for, and that was really exciting.
Check it out!
Right off the bat, I want to acknowledge just how damn funny this movie is. As I've kinda already alluded to, Friendship is much more than just its comedic elements, but those comedic elements are still one of the most unique and genius aspects of the movie. In a lot of ways, Friendship feels like a giant stitching together of tons of smaller little comedy sketch scenes. I mentioned I Think You Should Leave already, and Friendship very much lives within that kind of comedic style, tone, and execution. It's not exactly the same, but it's very similar. The humor of this story comes almost entirely from one person, usually Tim Robinson's Craig Waterman, who behaves so strangely and so against what we would consider normal that it just gets too downright weird, awkward, and bizarrely uncomfortable to not be at least a little bit funny.
I can eat whatever the hell I want. Something big and messy, something really embarrassing I don't want anybody to see, something that stinks.
It starts small, with little moments of social and tonal deftness from Craig Waterman that make us chuckle. Sometimes he says something unexpected, makes a weird face at an inappropriate time, or signals to us in some way that he's not quite on the same page as everyone else in the room. This is pretty funny and charming at first, but the longer the movie continues, the more and more unhinged Craig's behavior becomes, and as a result, it garners bigger and bigger reactions from the others in the story. It just reaches a point where the stuff happening on screen is so odd, so illogical, and so baffling that you really can't help but laugh. But it's not just random humor, there is a lot more going on in a lot of ways. This movie contains a shocking amount of depth the more you dig into it, and as you do so, the jokes and awkward moments start to make more and more sense, and I would argue the more hilarious it all becomes.
She's not here.
Where is she?
She's in the sewer. What?
Now, before I dive headfirst into all the other stuff that makes this movie so amazing, I want to properly acknowledge the two major ways that Friendship blew past my expectations. The first is obvious, in that while it is still very much an awkward, absurd comedy film, it's also kind of a horror movie. That was the first big surprise, or at least it was for me, because apparently I would have known this if I had just watched the trailer.
Look, we had a couple of really nice hangs, but I think it best that we go our separate ways. I don't wish to continue this friendship.
However, the second subversion of my expectations was that Friendship isn't just an entertaining ride, but rather it's depicting and commenting upon something very real, something I feel is seen and experienced a lot in the real world, but that isn't often shown in movies, or at least not in the way that Friendship shows it. As you may already be familiar with, Tim Robinson is a master of playing outlandish, strange, obnoxiously socially inept individuals. It's pretty much what makes up the entirety of every single episode of I Think You Should Leave, and it's great. He's nearly always playing the weirdest guy in the room, the guy that just doesn't quite understand social cues, that doesn't know how he's coming across, that can't read a room, and as a result of this, usually ends up making everyone feel deeply uncomfortable or unsafe. But he typically only plays these odd characters in collections of short comedic sketches. We never really spend much time with any one of them because that isn't usually the point of the stuff that he makes. With Friendship, however, he gets an entire 100-minute movie and the lead role to explore one of these such characters in much, much more depth than he has before. And that's where I think things get really interesting, because Robinson and Friendship's director, Andrew DeYoung, take this opportunity to explore and depict the impact this kind of a character really has on the people in their lives, and eventually, what kind of impact they leave on themselves. So with that, let's talk about Craig Waterman, because that's what this all revolves around. Craig is the type of person we see fairly often in stories, but is very rarely the protagonist of said stories, and even more rarely is depicted quite so honestly. He's a person who, for whatever reason, lacks a lot of very important human skills that leads him to gel very strangely with the world and people around him. He seemingly has no grasp of self-awareness, or emotional awareness, or empathy. He seemingly can't read a room, can't relate to anything outside his own experience, and has virtually no filter.
I got a product you might like.
Alright. Porno mag?
This type of character is almost always a side character to a more confident, charismatic, sociable, and self-aware lead, and is also very nearly always played for laughs. Which, he's played for laughs here as well, but it doesn't feel exploitative. It feels, at least to me, like it's depicting and critiquing the reality of this type of person, while allowing itself and us as an audience to laugh at the sheer hilarity of the happenings, but also still purposefully acknowledging the gray areas and creating appropriate sympathy. So, when I make these video essays, I typically try to hold off on talking about my personal connection to the story until pretty much the very end, but with this one, I think it'd really help flesh out what makes Craig, and by extension this whole movie, so great. Throughout my own life, for various reasons, I've known and often made friends with a lot of people that I think can be fairly described as very socially awkward. People that don't really talk with you, but rather they talk at you. People that don't really have proper concepts of boundaries. People that don't really listen the way others listen to them, or show up for others the way others show up for them. People that just don't really interact with reality in quite the same way as most everyone else does. And I want it stated now, I'm absolutely not hating on these type of people. As I've said, I'm friends with and also love a lot of people like this, but I also think it's still okay to point out and acknowledge the reality. And definitely please don't think I'm saying all of these people are like Craig. Craig is an extreme and rather negative example. Some of these people I've known over the years do have a tendency to frustrate and exhaust me at times, though. Sometimes I feel like they never really listen, sometimes I feel like our friendship is one-sided, and sometimes I even feel like they won't grow up or mature in the ways that maybe it would be best for them to. There are plenty of people like this that are fantastic individuals with hearts of gold, and there's also plenty of individuals like this whose missing social skills and etc. lean them more towards narcissism, unhealthy overattachment, and toxicity. And I've known a few like that too. Hell, I've even got some family members like that. So, needless to say, I've felt a certain kind of way about all of this for quite some time. It's been a pretty notable part of my life, and one that I honestly felt pretty alone in my experience with. But then along came friendship, and more specifically, along came Craig Waterman, and I felt in a lot of ways that my experience was seen and understood. Because this is what Craig Waterman is. Craig Waterman is that type of person, all grown up, who managed to get himself a stable job, a wife, a son, maybe, a house, and etc. But even though he's achieved and acquired all of this, and made it to his 40s or 50s, I assume, he's still ruled by the social skills he never acquired as he grew up. And this story picks up right at the point where the normal that he's established for himself begins to fracture.
Can I use your restroom really fast?
Through the introduction of Paul Rudd's Austin, Craig gains a brand new connection, or rather fixation, that radically alters his life. The film makes it very clear in the first act that Craig has been living his life basically the same way every day. But then he meets Austin, who's a weatherman, collects interesting objects, likes to go on adventures, smokes, and even has a band. To Craig, he's the very definition of cool, and the opposite of nearly everything in Craig's own life. So they hang out. Craig gets toxically attached, doesn't quite show his more negative qualities right away, and then as he starts getting closer with Austin and his larger friend group, he shows his true colors, and makes the entire situation strange, uncomfortable, and deeply concerning. And when he's inevitably rejected from the group, Craig not only is not able to handle that, but he also doesn't have the emotional skills to appropriately make it right, or just move on. And what follows is a slow, nightmarish spiral of obsession, rejection, and legitimate danger. Austin ends up being the force that finally breaks Craig's established status quo and snowballs everything else in his life to fall apart.
You rats! You called the f***ing cops!
I guess I haven't even mentioned the other characters in this story. I think one of the creative decisions that makes friendship work so beautifully is that Craig feels completely and entirely like an anomaly in his own narrative. He's played over the top, bizarre, and consistently comedic, whereas literally every single other character is represented as just a normal person. Well, mostly everyone, but that's another thing entirely.
She's so beautiful! Get the f*** out of the garage! F*** you psycho! Who are you?
Everyone else in friendship just feel like regular people, and not even just regular people for a comedy film, but regular people for a drama film. Kate Mara's Tammy is the most obvious example of this. She feels like she's from a somber, reflective, quiet drama film, which perfectly creates contrast between her and Craig, and it's much the same for Austin, Devin, Bianca, and so on. They feel like real people with real strengths and real flaws. Because while Craig is certainly the most problematic force in the story, Tammy, Austin, and the others are certainly being shitty at times in their own ways. In a lot of ways, Friendship feels like a grounded, relationship-driven drama film was meant to take place, but then Tim Robinson showed up to be crazy and just dominated the entire thing. And, I mean, that's awesome. That's exactly the point, and it works beautifully. And so what the story ends up being is a very intriguing and darkly funny depiction of a man who maybe didn't mature in all the best ways, witnessing the collapse of all that he has achieved. And for the characters around him, the story ends up being that of acceptance and of moving on. We see that Craig's son, maybe, seemingly just moves forward with who his dad is, accepting him despite his numerous flaws. Tammy finally breaks free of him and begins to find herself in a new place, and Austin just completely accepts that Craig is who he is, and in the end is able to smile at who he is, and humor him for who he is. It's a pretty rough ending for Craig, as he must face the full consequences of his life's decisions, but for everyone else around him, it's somewhat optimistic, albeit still slightly sad. Now, that's the core story of Friendship, but now I'd like to take the time to talk about all of the incredible stuff that contributes to this narrative being as successful as it is. And firstly, I'd like to highlight the subtle but effective scene choice throughout the entire movie. Obviously, what things you do and don't show in any movie is important. That's the entirety of what makes movies movies. But here, there's something in specific that's really interesting about what we are and aren't shown, and it's one of the most significant contributors to why the depiction of this type of character is so effective. In Friendship, each scene only really exists if it's something that matters to Craig. We've already established his lack of key social skills, narcissism, and etc., and Friendship really brings you into his head by keeping everything that Craig cares about at the forefront, and everything he doesn't care about, or doesn't notice, in the background. Unless I'm just stupid and forgetting something, there is not a single scene in this entire movie that doesn't feature Craig in some capacity. He's always around, and it's always about something that matters to him. But it's highlighted even more by what we don't see. Friendship gives off this strange sense that more time is passing than we are aware of, and that more significant things are occurring than maybe we are getting all the information on. Craig's son, maybe, a ways into the film is asked if he has any crushes, and he says yes. And then later, when we hear from him again, he just straight up has a girlfriend. And even later, he has two. For some reason. But Craig never acknowledges this in pretty much any way. It just happens, and he seems oblivious and uncaring. And the movie barely dwells on it either, because the emphasis is on keeping us in Craig's head, conveying his experience the way he relates with reality. There's like a million examples of this type of stuff. The Watermans are in the process of selling their house, which should be a big deal, but it never is. Tammy, Craig's literal wife, has previously recovered from cancer and is still struggling with the mental and emotional aftermath of that battle, which should also be a big deal, but again, it isn't. It's barely addressed. Tammy also continuously alludes to plans happening in her life with her friends, or with her ex, and struggles she's having with her business, her car, and so on. All of which comes into Craig's consciousness for mere moments before he swiftly brushes them aside and gets back to what he actually cares about. Craig is only focused on what he specifically cares about, and it's not the people around him, it's not his relationships, it's not his wife or his son, maybe, or literally any of that stuff. It's either just all about Craig, or all about his obsession with Austin, which really is just all about Craig. As a result of all of this, there's so much important stuff happening just outside of Craig's field of vision, both good and bad. He's losing his grip on his work, he's losing his wife to another man, and basically he has no idea. He's just not there for anyone, at all.
I'm sick of struggling. I need a bigger car.
I gotta go.
You still have blood in your nose.
That's fine. That's
Wipe
fine.
it off.
I think it's just so incredible and so entrancing how the movie pulls us into the mind of this type of person by focusing only on what matters to its protagonist, and leaving everything outside of his interest completely alone, ignored, dismissed, or entirely unresolved. I also want to highlight, without listing all 5 bazillion of them, because I want to do that, but we'd be here forever, some of the really specific, subtle, detail-oriented moments of symbolism scattered throughout the film, most of which, for the record, are left entirely unexplained, so I might be missing the mark completely, but, you know, I'm giving my 2 cents anyway. This is just what I do, I guess. I love the usage of the speed bump in Craig's neighborhood and how much it means to him. He flaunts it as one of his greatest accomplishments, and it's a great indicator of how he perceives the freedom of others, dragging them down to a level of stale, restricted normalcy, dragging them down to his level. It's also great how many times he is shown walking over it, and in the end, when he completely loses it, how he abandons his self-proclaimed rules for the neighborhood entirely, and ends up wrecking because of his own established limit. I also love, in what is one of the best scenes of the whole movie, Craig's trip on Toad. He's given this big promise that it will be a grand journey for his mind and that it may feel like ages, and yet all he experiences is a brief visit to Subway. His mind takes him here because earlier he saw a Subway in association with Austin, and he sees Austin, obviously, because he's obsessed with him. But he imagines him as older, which could maybe mean lesser to Craig, and he imagines Austin serving him, which says a lot about the type of relationship he desires for them.
Did you get the answer you were looking for?
No, I ordered a sandwich at Subway.
There's just so much great stuff that I feel can be easily overlooked if this film were examined merely as a comedy. The nosebleeds Craig experiences, the effect Tammy's flowers have on him, the literal and metaphorical dark tunnel Craig's relationship completely falls apart in, the way he envisions himself saving humanity and carrying Austin to safety, only for things to end up just the opposite. And the list goes on. The amount of little details packed into this film is immense, each one very easy to overlook. They all stack up to build this incredible narrative and this incredible character, each one a moment of brilliant comedy on the surface, but that also double as deeper, darker glimpses into who Craig is, many of which I, at the very least, feel are surprisingly real and relatable. There's a lot of stuff that is said and done in this movie that was not only great for this film and its characters, but that mere interactions I've had, and probably many others have had, numerous times with the type of people in life that are most like Craig.
Teenage girls these days, they look like they're 25 years old. I guess it's the same with the guys, too.
And now, to barrel through the last few things that make this film so amazing, but that I'm not going to dwell on, I just want to acknowledge the cinematography. This film is just shot so damn well. It's lit well, it's colored well, and every moment is composed beautifully to capture the reality of this narrative and its characters. And the music, of course, is phenomenal. Friendship has a remarkably short instrumental score, but each one really packs a punch, and I love the diversity in genres. Most of it has this great electronic, older, synthy feel, but there's also a lot more classical stuff, and then also drums and chants. It really helps sell the multifaceted nature of this story. All of this phenomenal presentation, all of these fleshed out details and characters, and this entire story as a whole, make for one hell of a film. What I wanted from Friendship was really just a great comedy in a style that I'm a big fan of. And what I got was not only that, but also a surprisingly layered, rich character study on a very real type of person. A type of person that I would say isn't depicted all too often or all too honestly. And not only was this done quite tastefully, framing this character in a brutally honest yet clearly sympathetic nature, but it managed to be wildly, ridiculously hilarious in the process, and have gorgeous music and visuals to boot. Friendship truly defied all my expectations and now stands as something I appreciate and connect very deeply with, admire for its originality and artistry, and adore for its complex yet hysterical storytelling.